Hello again, good friends. I'm Bill Press, host of the Bill Press Pod, here with the next installment of this special podcast series, Trump's Project 2025, Up Close and Personal. Now, Chapter 10, The Dangerous Consequences of the Attack on Equity and Science. This attack starts with that word, woke. Yes, it's an insult that right-wing Republicans came up with to describe people and policies which simply recognize that systemic racism exists in America, that sexism exists in America, and that discrimination against LGBTQ plus people exists in America. For these anti-woke crusaders, racism and sexism simply don't exist, and gender roles are fixed, men and women, once and for all. That's it. And any attempts to mitigate the effects of this kind of discrimination in education, in housing, in employment, in healthcare are decried as woke. Project 2025 and Donald Trump will take aim at anyone and anything that tries to make life better for these disadvantaged folks. Our story today begins with a scientist who spent years studying cancer clusters that disproportionately impact Black Americans. The first part of the chapter is read by the actress who played the fearsome general of the Special Forces for the fictional African nation of Wakanda. Here is Danai Gurira.
But we're so close, Matthias. So close.
Dr. Joy Brewer and Dr. Matthias Kunz, the director of North Charleston State's Cancer Center, walked through the lush grass in front of Hampton Hall. The red brick building and its iconic clock tower were centerpiece of the stunning campus. And the Hampton Green never looked better than on fall mornings. Still, nothing about the picturesque setting could ease the conversation among two longtime colleagues.
I know, but there's nothing I can do. The grants have been canceled.
Which grants?
Joy asked.
All of them. Immediately.
Her head jerked back his way, jostling the cat-eye red glasses that had become her signature around campus.
But why?
She knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him articulate it. He shrugged, an expression she'd seen a lot lately. His attitude had been different since the start of the school year.
You've watched Washington for the past year. They are obsessed with eliminating woke from the federal government.
Woke. Her temperature spiked just hearing the word. It was all so ridiculous. The first target had been critical race theory. But since her work had nothing to do with that high-level law school approach, the anti-CRT frenzy never impacted her. But when they ran out of steam, the attack broadened to diversity and equity, DEI, gender. Bizarrely, childless women got tossed into the mix. And then they threw everything together with the catch-all term, woke. Somewhere along the way, even her painstaking work to save lives got caught up in the McCarthy-style frenzy of labels and accusations.
What does this have to do with being woke? We're studying cancer clusters that disproportionately impact Black Americans. It's the best of science and medicine, and we're on the verge of major breakthroughs.
And by major breakthroughs, she meant tens of thousands of lives lengthened by decades.
I know. We're so proud of your work, but I heard it directly, and so did the provost. The administration's bright-line policy is that no federal grants can refer to race or gender or be motivated by race or gender, so they are canceling all of them, and they will investigate any borderline cases.
A light breeze blew Dr. Kunz's gray comb-over out of place. He quickly reached up and pushed it back. Joy had wrapped her jet-black hair in a tight bun, so it didn't budge.
Believe me,
Joy said, shivering in her red leather jacket.
I wish the cancer clusters we're studying didn't disproportionately impact Black women. But they do. It's just basic scientific inquiry to figure out why, then prevent it.
The air cooled further as they stepped into the shadow of Hampton Hall. When you grew up in the South, you always looked up the names. So after she landed the job at North Charleston State, Joy had done some digging. It turned out the grandest building on campus was named after Wade Hampton, one of the Old South's largest slave owners and a Confederate general. He'd later entered politics, playing a leading role in toppling Reconstruction. He was celebrated as the savior of South Carolina for having ushered in an era of white supremacy that survived until only a few years before Joy was born. The most woke thought Joy ever had was the delight of fighting to improve Black health, a half-mile from a building celebrating one of Jim Crow's founders. But still, science was science, and in this case, the data was clear. Her work was saving lives.
We've argued that again and again. They won't listen.
Even when it's to remedy a problem that Black women shoulder disproportionately?
Specifically when that is the case. The singular focus is what is prohibited.
Joy felt sick. So much was about to be lost. Leveraging federal grants, she'd built a formidable team over the past decade. Her diverse, passionate researchers and students were tracking cancer clusters all across the country, in small towns and big cities. And they were pinpointing the scientific and societal factors fueling disproportionately high death rates among Black women. Their work was lifting a population whose worst health outcomes had long been ignored by establishment scientists.
I'm afraid you will have to redirect your research to another purpose.
She fixed her glare forward while clenching her jaw. The words hit her harder than anything thus far.
Another purpose.
This was her purpose, her life's mission, foisted on her by tragedy. She was 15 when her mother's death at 39 years old had cut short her childhood and devastated her family. Her father never recovered, and she'd essentially raised her younger brother. Dad, an Atlanta math teacher, dug into the cancer that had devastated Mom's body over mere months, and what he found was that young and middle-aged Black women from rural Georgia were dying of it at a rate far higher than others. He wrote letter after letter to politicians and med schools and hospital executives, begging them to do something about it. And all he got back were form letters full of non-answers. As a white man married to a Black woman, he'd of course witnessed the sting of racism most days since they'd begun dating, but the response here taught him a far more painful lesson. America's elite, systemically dismissing his concern about life and death itself, showed just how ingrained that racism was and its devastating consequences. 3 years later, as Joy entered Emory, Dad died of a heart attack. When she found his binders of research and box of letters, it broke her heart too. She switched her English major to biology and dedicated her life to lengthening the lives of women like her mother. She would listen to her father's pleas when no one else would.
It's all I've ever done, Matthias. I think you know that. I can't just start a new field.
You're a smart woman, Joy. You even apply for research grants in a different way. Broaden your focus and adjust the language you use, and perhaps you'll still be approved.
She cringed again at his words, the way he said them, demeaning in so many ways. What if she told him to just change his core mission, to strip his life work of its central purpose, to be disingenuous about what drove him? She bit her lip as another gust of wind ruffled his comb-over.
How many others will be impacted by this?
Joy, this will devastate so much of our work. Our research on how climate change impacts different populations, our work on infant mortality of Black babies.
Joy was friends with the globally recognized scientists doing this work.
And the high mortality of Black mothers too?
That as well, all unfunded now. So we're forced to transition on the fly. Our goal is to save as many jobs and as much research as we can. We have payroll to make even though the grants that pay it are gone. If we don't move fast, other universities will swoop in and take all the funds.
Transition. He was talking fast, but she was still stuck on that one word. This was all transactional to Matthias, scrambling to keep the spigot flowing, altering words, purposes. Joy looked down at her feet, glowering.
You can't just transition the calling you've served your entire life, or abandon the thousands of families relying on you.
The air warmed as they stepped out of the long shadow of Hampton Hall. Joy stopped talking, forcing Matthias to do the same. At just over 5 feet tall, she looked up at him, right in his eyes, unable to fake a smile.
Matthias, I appreciate all the support you've given my work over the years, but I can't change what I'm working on any more than I can change who I am.
He cocked his head.
So I'm afraid I won't be able to transition.
But you understand what that means?
He asked, frowning. She nodded, knowing he had one job to accomplish on this walk: clarity as to who was in and who was out.
I do. But if you're asking me to choose between staying here and staying true to who I am, I have no choice.
I understand,
he said, amid another gust. She reached up and patted him on the shoulder, said nothing more, and walked back to her lab for the final time. General Wade Hampton may have outlasted her at North Charleston State, but she was still Chris and Nina Brewer's daughter, and that mattered more.
When we come back after a short break, we look at the story from the other side, the nasty, cruel side. It's a story of an anti-woke crusader from Florida who's been given the job by Donald Trump in a second administration to rid the federal government of anything having to do with woke. Later in the podcast, Arthur David Pepper will tie each of the story elements back to Trump's own words and dangerous promises. But first, the second part of Trump's Project 2025, Up Close and Personal, Chapter 10, The Dangerous Consequences of the Attack on Equity and Science. Here we're going to meet Webster Powers, a former Florida state representative who rode his anti-woke agenda all the way to Washington. In our fictional story, he's now in a position in a second Trump term, guided by Project 2025, to destroy the life work of thousands of scientists and educators to the detriment of the disadvantaged people they were trying to help. Lives will be lost. The film and television actor Joel Hurt Jones reads Part 2.
Chapter 10, October, Capital Monthly. Webster Powers by Calvin Stegman, Washington, D.C. For Webster Webb Powers, today was the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl he'd been training for years. "Welcome to the new Washington, friends," he boomed, raising his thick, pale arms in the air as he spoke. "We are so glad to have you here." With a capacity of 1,500 people, every seat of the Hilton ballroom was full. But despite his words, Webb knew that these were not his friends, nor were they excited about his new Washington. The wide-eyed stares, glares, and frowns made that perfectly clear. So did the diversity of the crowd. These people were scared, and they were right to be. He controlled all of their fates. After years of being treated like a pariah, he was the one on top. "Today marks one of the most important moments in the new administration," he continued. "So I'm glad we're all here together to consecrate it." Today's triumph was a long time coming. Back when Webb was 20 pounds thinner and sported a full head of thick brown hair, he sold condos along the white sands of Florida's Gulf Coast and minded his own business. His political journey only began when, a few months into 5th grade, his oldest son Charlie began asking all sorts of questions about Indians, slaves, and blacks during the early 1900s. Why, young Charlie prodded with concern, had they all been treated so badly? This was before homework, so Webb asked Charlie's teacher to show him the school's teaching materials, and what he saw infuriated him. Books obsessing about what had been done wrong in American history without enough celebration of all that was right. Almost as many photos of slave ships and civil rights rallies as battlefield heroes and great inventors. It was like it had been written by blacks and Indians and women and not the white Christian men who had made America what it was. Worse, it actually made those men look terrible at times. The next day, Webb pulled Charlie and his younger sister Peggy from the school. But cutting off the indoctrination of his own kids was only step one. Eradicating those anti-American, anti-white, anti-Christian history books became his singular obsession. He first rallied parents across the Panhandle to join his cause, filling up school board meetings, then the State House. He flipped the destined school board majority by turning out voters when few others were paying attention. Then he ran for the State House himself, facing no opposition in the general election after winning his GOP primary on his anti-indoctrination agenda. Tallahassee gave him the platform he needed to clean up classrooms statewide. Government funds and policies should never favor one race over another, nor should they favor other groups at the expense of white Christian Americans. That was classic racism, and it needed to be snuffed out. Amid those speeches, he introduced a simple bill.
A new law in Florida is restricting how schools and businesses can address the subject of race.
Eliminate any references to racial equity or diversity or gender or critical race theory or anything that resembled any of that garbage from any level of education in Florida. It was bold and sweeping, and it put Webb Powers on the national political map, leading to interviews and conferences and speeches across the country.
Florida is again in the middle of cultural and political debate.
The pushback in Florida had been fierce, personal, and nasty. But that only confirmed how locked in the woke philosophy was, even in a red state like Florida. That, and the fact that even Charlie and Peggy remained transfixed by their early exposure, inspired Webb to push harder. Because if they couldn't stop it here, they couldn't stop it anywhere, and if his own kids could be brainwashed, no kids were safe. The good news was that despite the angry reaction from the woke mob, most of his colleagues in the Florida State House signed on. They added more topics to remove from classrooms, like climate science. In the end, all the anger aimed their way didn't matter. They ran it over and defeated the woke, as they all liked to say. And more than he expected, Webb inspired a movement. Dozens of other states went on to pass similar laws. All those wins were nice, of course, but they weren't the Super Bowl. That was today, when Webb would take it all national and way beyond just education. As you know, the president is following through on the promises he made last year. We have scrutinized every budget, used AI to scan every policy, and examined all grant programs the federal government oversees. The lack of eye contact, the lowered chins, gave those gathered away, along with their size and sagging shoulders. This audience looked down on people like him. He'd felt it in Florida, where he'd been treated like an angry dad with no real standing to take them on. Just a rube from the Panhandle. Later, the same snobbery dripped off editorial pages across the nation. But the misery in this ballroom grew not just because they were being forced to listen to a non-degreed and overweight Luddite like him. No, their pained expressions came because they knew what was coming. They knew that this sweating, angry dad was about to announce the devastation of many of their livelihoods, careers, and the institutions they served. And they were right. And as we completed our work, what we found is an even bigger scandal than we had imagined. Scandal was a powerful word these days. With the DOJ and the FBI in the president's hands, scandal meant investigations whenever they chose them. and prosecutions whenever they chose them. So using the word scandal in this speech was an intimidation tactic, one the White House encouraged. 10 months had taught them that people resisted far less whenever they wrapped an issue in scandal, and Webb was about to wrap it big time. What we found is that billions of dollars in federal research is being invested in pure racism. Billions spent to advance the woke DEI and sexual agenda in just about every way you can imagine. In who you've been hiring, in the research you've been doing and articles you've been writing, in the art you've been commissioning, and in the socialist ideology you've been propagating. While most sat up, ramrod still, a few heads in the audience had the audacity to shake at these words, which only made him smile more. So why am I so excited about today's announcement? Simple. He paused for effect. Beginning today, as promised, we are deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity. He slowed down. These were terms these people had lived off of their entire lives. He wanted every word to be heard. Equity and inclusion, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, and reproductive rights from every federal rule, agency, regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. Faces remained mostly frozen in place, eyes vacant. But Webb knew earthquakes were erupting within each of the arrogant heads before him. And to be clear, when I say equity and inclusion, it means we are eliminating any reference to race in all the same areas. As he practiced, he pounded the podium so that it shook his microphone, causing a loud thud to echo throughout the ballroom. Every, he pounded again. Boom. Last. Boom. One. Boom. Did you hear that, friends? A few in the crowd nodded. I can't hear you. Yes. He scanned left and right. Did you hear that? Yes. A number said yes out loud unhappily. Some rolled their eyes. Drips of sweat were now forming on his nearly bald head, as always happened when he was on a roll. He used a napkin to wipe them off. Louder, please! Yes! They yelled out. Webb grinned, enjoying how pathetic they were. He had just persuaded a room of eggheads, university and hospital presidents, deans, professors, provosts, scientists, doctors, business leaders, and other researchers to shout yes to a mortal threat to their worlds. Pathetic and perfect. A DEI audience affirming its own demise. Plus, these were the people who had convinced his own kids to turn against him once they reached college, with Charlie coming out his freshman year. So watching them squirm was fitting payback. But the best part was yet to come, because this was far bigger than erasing words. And you heard me say grants and contracts, right? A murmur. I can't hear you. Some now said yes. Again, louder. Yes! Was shouted from various corners of the room, not with enthusiasm, but loudly enough so he could move on. Good. All grants and contracts with references to any of those words or race or gender generally are immediately terminated. Not a penny more from the government will support any of your institutions doing such racist work. The federal government is out of the woke history, woke science, DEI, and gender sensitivity business forever. More murmurs, a few head shakes, but overall this group was far more submissive than those mobs back in Tallahassee, back when the American woke still thought it would win. Together, the people in this room received billions in federal grant money. They'd been the willing accomplices of the deep state, scooping up billions to advance a poisonous mission. For many, his announcement would surely mean the end of the gravy train, careers and jobs and institutions terminated, the true believers who were consumed by woke and had nothing else to offer. Good riddance. For others, though, the money was the prize, always had been. For the nimble ones, this would not mean the end, just a change of purpose, a new mission funded by Webb and the federal government. They would submit and serve the new government's needs. Did this mean they were corrupt? Of course. Government was corrupt by nature. So were those who gobbled up government funds. But Webb now controlled its direction and the new ideology the spending would advance. The difference between those openly shaking their heads at his words and those nodding told him which of the two groups they were in. We will now play a video for you explaining the specific changes and how they will impact you, followed by words of encouragement from the President. When you leave, staff will hand a packet explaining the new process of working with the federal government should you choose to keep doing so. Some faces relaxed, frowns evened out, some nods, relief everywhere. For most, he had just thrown them what they wanted, a lifeline. And this would lead to what he and the President wanted, submission. Money had a way of doing that. Thank you for your time. The applause was muted. The opposite of the cheers he got in friendly, less diverse crowds. Webb Powers didn't care. It had taken more time than he'd hoped when the President had appointed him in February. He'd lost his own family along the way, but now it was done. He had just fired woke from the United States of America.
Again, an important reminder. While the stories in this episode are over, we're not done with Trump's Project 2025. In a moment, author David Pepper will tie the real policies heard in Trump's own words to these fictional stories. But first, in the next episode of Trump's Project 2025, Up Close and Personal, we'll explore the life and death effects of Project 2025's plan to gut and privatize the National Weather Service, FEMA, and the nation's hurricane response team.
The fictional governor of Florida, Buck Bryce, addresses the media as Hurricane Timothy heads towards his state.
Florida's ready. I also just got off the phone with the president, who assured me they have our back if we need them. Fueled by sky-high Gulf temperatures, Timothy came ashore 2 mornings later as a monster Category 4 hurricane.
Sir, what we're seeing is devastating. Timothy's just raking the coast, as bad as any storm we've ever seen. And since no one was ready for it, we've got people trapped in houses and high-rises for miles. There'll be a significant death toll here, particularly seniors.
Bryce already knew this, but his face twitched as he heard the words. How the did they get this so wrong? He'd been assured by Washington that things would be okay, that the few meteorologists who raised alarms were fossils, not tapped into the latest data.
Implementing Project 2025 will literally kill people. That story in the next episode of Trump's Project 2025, Up Close and Personal. Chapter 11, Hurricane Trump.
Now, an important program note. Trump's Project 2025 Up Close and Personal is available on all the podcast apps and at 2025pod.com. Please subscribe, review, and most importantly, share the podcast with your friends and relatives who maybe have not yet made a plan to vote and who may not even know just how dangerous a second Trump term in Project 2025 would be. And by the way, if you've missed any episodes, or you want to share a previous episode most likely to motivate a specific person, you'll find the first 10 chapters in your podcast app. And again, while the people and the stories in this series are fictional, the policies that bring chaos and tragedy to each of their lives and to the entire country are all too real. Next, after the break, the author of our series, David Pepper, lays out the connections between our stories and Trump's own promises and the actual language of Project 2025. Once again, an important message. While this story is fiction, it's based on actual policies contained in Project 2025 and in Trump's own words and promises. Here's author David Pepper with the specific links to the text.
Just like Webster Power's words of Chapter 10, Project 2025 could not be more clear. In fact, his words are lifted directly out of Project 2025. Quote, "The next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists," end quote. That is on pages 4 and 5, straight up front of Project 2025. In the Health and Human Services section of Project 2025, the plan takes direct aim at the Biden approach of, quote, "promoting equity in everything we do for the sake of populations sharing a particular characteristic, including race, sexuality, gender identification, ethnicity, and a host of other categories," end quote, page 449. And throughout Project 2025, various authors target programs and grants that they claim advance, quote, "woke ideology," end quote. In the education section, for example, the plan calls for, quote, "an accounting of how federal programs and grants spread DEI, CRT, gender ideology," end quote. That's on page 358. Finally, because Project 2025 replaces experts and civil servants with political appointees, far more decisions over grant funding and contracts will now be in the hands of ideologues than actual experts. As Scientific American wrote, quote, "The independence of science is being attacked across the board in this document," end quote, says Rachel Cletus, policy director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Nonpartisan Union of Concerned Scientists. She continued, "The importance of this science is that that's how we can ensure people's health and the environment are being safeguarded," end quote. As Axios writes, quote, "Throughout all scientific agencies in the government, the plan calls on the president to, quote, ensure appointees agree with administration aims," end quote, which may allow political ideologues to overrule the expertise of trained scientists. Folks, it gets tossed around in politics a lot, but if taken seriously, this war on science, this war on diversity will have truly real-world implications, just as they are described in Chapter 10. Don't let it happen.
Trump's Project 2025 Up Close and Personal is available on all the podcast apps and at 2025pod.com. Now we'd like to thank all the artists who volunteered their time to make this episode. Danai, Gurira, and Joel Hurt-Jones, who read the chapter, and others who contributed character voices. Sound design by Jonathan Moser and Marilys Ernst. Trump's Project 2025 Up Close and Personal is written by David Pepper and produced by Pepper, Melissa Jo Peltier, and Jay Feldman, and is a production of Ovington Avenue Productions and the Bill Press Pod.